Hey, it's Library Boy. Welcome to another Chatbox tutorial video. In today's video, we are going to be answering a question that came in the comments. It's a great question. Greyhound Music asks how to style messages uniquely depending on the user group, VIP, mod, follower user, perhaps custom groups defined in the code. Would that be possible, or am I dreaming too big? So we're going to answer that today in this video, and we're going to create that mechanic from scratch in a chat box in Stream Elements. So let's get started. First, let's create our event listener to receive the messages, and it's always better to use the on event received rather than on session update because it has better performance. So use on event received if you can, and we'll make this async. There's our event listener. First, we'll store the listener so we can discern what type of event it is. And we can get that from the event object. And make sure to add an object as a parameter to the function. So now we'll check for relevant events. And we'll use a guard clause to exit early if it's not a relevant event. So if listener is not equal to message and listener is not equal to event test, then we'll just return early. Now we can check for the test. So if listener is equal to event test, we'll run our test function here. For now, we'll return. So now any code below this will be for the message event since we're using this guard clause. So let's store some things from the message before proceeding. So const message is equal to object.detail.event.data, and we'll get the display name, message.displayName, and the badges. Message.badges or an empty array. And let's declare the user group variable so that we can assign it a value in the future. Now, the main way we're going to be assigning a group to the users is by checking for their badges, because that's going to tell us whether they're subscriber, VIP, broadcaster, etc. So we will create a helper function to check if a specific badge exists in the array. So that'll just be a one-liner. So const hasBadge is equal to pass it the badge type. Then it's going to be badges.sum, and then it's going to check if the badge type is equal to the badge type that we're passing in. So now we can check what badges the user has and assign a user group to the user. So you want to put this in the highest priority first. So first I would check if they have the broadcaster badge. And if they do, then you assign them the broadcaster group. Now we can just continue with all the badges that we want to check. So else if moderator, we'll assign to moderator. Else if VIP, assign to VIP. Subscriber, premium, and then the last condition, we'll just set the default. So that'll be, let's do user. And right here, we can do custom logic for followers. Because Stream Elements does not provide that functionality, we'll have to create that ourselves. And I'm warning you, it is a lot, but we'll do that at the end of the video. There's many other badge types. So if you want to use those to assign user groups, you can just follow this pattern and use the name of the badge you want to use. Now, it would be irresponsible to run this logic every single time a message event occurs. So you want to memoize this so that it just runs on the first function call. And then after that, it can just quickly look up the user group or the user. To do that, we'll create a client class. So at the top of your file, we'll define that. So class client uppercase. And we'll create a constructor for the client class. And in that constructor, we will create a user cache. And that will be a map to store user data for quick lookup. Now we'll create getter and setter methods for getting and setting the user group. So we'll define a new method in our client class called getUserGroup, and we'll pass it the display name. And we will get the user group from the user cache. That will be const cached data is equal to this dot user cache dot get, and then pass it the display name. So if the cache data exists, then we can return the user group. If it doesn't exist, then we'll just return null. Now let's define our setter method. So we'll call it set user group. And we need to pass it the display name and the user group. And to set the user group, we'll just say this dot user cache dot set, and display name will be the key, and the value will be an object with the user group. And then below our client class, we can just create the client instance globally. So we'll say const client is equal to new client. Now in our event listener, after our hasBadge helper function, we can call our getter method on our client class to get the user group. So const cached group is equal to client dot get user group and pass it the display name. Now, if the cached group exists, then we can assign that to the user group. So if the cached group exists, we don't need to run the logic below that. So we'll create an else, and we'll wrap all of our logic inside of that else. And then before closing the if else for our cached group, so if there's no cached group, we need to assign the user group using our setter method. So we'll just say client set user group and pass it the display name and the user group. So now first it's going to check if the cached group exists. If it doesn't, it'll run this logic and then assign that user group to the user. And if it does exist, then it'll just use that cached group. So now we can begin displaying the message along with the user group and assign a class to those rows so that you can style them uniquely based on the user group. So after we initiate the client class, I'm going to add a new function, and that function is going to be called addRow, and it's going to be an async function. And we're going to pass it the text, the emotes, the name, and the user group. Now at the very bottom of our event listener, we can call that function, and we can pass it our text, emotes, name, and user group. In our addRow function, let's create a reference to container. Container equals document get element by ID, and the ID is container. And so we need to go into our HTML and create that container. So create a div with an ID of container, save, and go back. Now we can create the row with row equals document create element, and it'll be a div element. And then we can assign a class to it. It'll be the row class. Now we can set the inner HTML of the row. So we're going to have a space for the user group. So I'll create user group HTML. And this will be a template string, the div. And for the class of that div, we can assign the user group and set it to lowercase. That way, when you assign the name of the user group down here, you can use capitals if you want. And give it the user group so that text shows. Now I'll create a name HTML for the name and a message HTML for the message text. And finally, we'll assign all those to the row's inner HTML. Now we will append that to the container with container.append. Now you can also add the user group to the class list for the row if you want to style it that way as well. And then for the message, we're just using the text, but if you want to also add the emotes, you can use the handle emotes function that we used in the sliding chat box. And to do that, you would just await the function handle emotes and pass it the text and emotes. In the CSS, you can create a class for each unique user group that you're using. For example, I have the VIP broadcaster, subscriber, user, and follower. And then you can just style them uniquely however you'd like. I'll have the font weight, bold, padding, 2 pixels, 4 pixels, and color gold for VIP. And then I can just use like different colors for different ones, so on and so forth. And then for the rest of this CSS, I'm just going to use the standard stuff we used for the sliding chat. And that will be for the body, container, row, name, and message, and the emote. We need to set up the test function. So I'm going to use the exact same one as the sliding chat box as well. So at the bottom of the file, I will paste that, and it is called simulate message event. So in our event listener, when we listen for the tests, we can call the simulate message event function. And then in our fields, we need to set up that button. So we'll say test button. That's going to have a type. Its value is button, a label, which is the text of the button, and a value to reference the button. And everything needs quotes. So when we go and test the widget, you'll see it assigns us a user group and displays it. And if you open the console, you will see that on the first function call, it runs the logic to assign the group. And then on the second one, it uses the cast result. So pretty good stuff. So in our user group logic, I said we had custom logic for followers. So I found that that is completely outside the scope of Stream Elements. So I actually had to create this entire microservice just for that. And it's not exactly beginner friendly. It really deserves its own dedicated video. But what I will do is link the GitHub to this, and I will show you how to implement it into the widget right now. So all the code moving forward will require that you have the widget service deployed, which it's unlikely that most people will be willing to go through the trouble to do that. However, I still wanted to show how I solved this particular problem. So to create the logic to assign the user to a follower user group, we need to set up a few things for that. First of all, we only get the display name from the message, but we actually need the user ID in order to check the follower status. So I set up an endpoint for getting the user ID from the display name. So create a new async function called getUserId and pass it the display name and have a try catch. And now I'm going to fetch my endpoint for getting the user ID. So const response is equal to await fetch. And then I'm going to give it my endpoint in a template string. And we need to give it the display name. Now we'll just await the JSON response. And then if the response is okay and the user ID exists, then we'll just return the user ID. Else we'll console log the error and return null. And in our catch, we will log the error and return null. Now in our custom follower logic, we can get that user ID so that we can check the follower status. Now we need to set up the function for getting the follower status. So we'll set up another async function below the getUserId, and we'll call it checkFollowerStatus. And we need to pass it a user ID and channel ID. Now I'll fetch my endpoint, pass it the user ID and channel ID, and then get the data response back. And then if the response is okay and data.isFollowing is not equal to undefined, then we can return data is following. Else we will throw a new error and we'll say failed to check follower status. Now you do need to get your channel ID, and the easiest way to do that would just be to type in on Google, convert Twitch username to channel ID, and there's plenty of websites that will do that for you. Just put in your display name, and then it'll give you back your channel ID. Then at the top of the file, to set that as a global variable. Now in our follower logic, we can check if they're following and assign them to the follower user group if they are. So after we get the user ID, we will say if the user ID exists, then we will check if they are following. So we will await our checkFollowerStatus function, pass it the user ID and channel ID. Then we can assign the user group to follower if it's true and user if it's false. Else, we'll just assign them to user. And then we can wrap all of our follower logic in a try catch. Try catch. If there's an error, we'll log that and we'll set the user group to user. Now that's everything. If you come and test that from an account that's just following, you'll see that it assigns the follower user group to the user. So that's everything for implementing the user group mechanic into the chat box. I hope that helped. Please leave any comments if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time. Peace.